Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. And this time we're going to finish off the story of how Henry VI lost the throne to Edward IV of the Yorkist triumph in 1461. And we've been thinking in the past couple of episodes about the 1450s and the ups and downs of Lancastrians and Yorkists fortunes during those 1450s. Remember that it starts out with Lancastrians firmly in control and Richard of York really being shut out of government by Somerset and by Margaret of Anjou. But then in 1455, the first battle of St Albans, Richard of York showed his hand and struck to gain control and killed Somerset, seemingly kind of winning over the government. But in the late 1450s, his control over that subsides, and that's probably credit to Margaret of Anjou as a political schemer and creator of a faction. And in 1459, York is actually forced to flee to Ireland, and his son and Warwick flee to Calais after the Battle of Ludford Bridge. And again, that seems like the Lancastrians are back in charge and back in control. But Warwick in particular and Edward of York, Richard's son, come back in 1460 with a force and invade England, defeating the king's army and capturing the king at Northampton. And that again seems to turn the tide to the Yorkists before Margaret of Anjou struck back at the Battle of Wakefield, killing Richard of York and seeming to now have control of the country, but not being able to get to London because of her ill-disciplined army. Now, while all that was going on, you might be wondering where Edward had been. Well, Edward had gone west to face another Lancastrian force, and he'd ended up doing that just before the Second Battle of St Albans, out in the West Country at a place called Mortimer's Cross. This was young Edward of York's first battle in command, and it seals his reputation for good leadership, but also for being anointed by God, partly because on dawn of the day of battle, it looked in the sky like there were three suns rising on the horizon. This is called a parhelion, Parhelion, parhelion. And apparently Edward's troops were scared, or so the story goes, but Edward managed to persuade them that actually this was a sign the three suns represented the Holy Trinity, and this was a sign that God was on their side. They then win the battle, of course, which cements that idea that Edward is blessed by God. And actually what we see here is, both good commandership of his troops to persuade them to fight, but then also good commandership in the battle. So this keeps the Yorkists just about in the game. Two little consequences of this battle are, one, that Owen Tudor, Henry Tudor's father, is one of the Lancastrian commanders and is executed after the battle. And that Warwick meets up with Edward shortly after having fled from the defeat at Northampton. Warwick and Edward come back to London, which had been left open to them by Margaret of Anjou because she had had the gates locked to her. And in London, Edward, hearing of the death of his father, proclaims himself to be the rightful king, Edward IV. And he is accepted in London by the supporters that are there and by the local population as the new king. And this is quite a big turning point because now we actually have a Yorkist on the throne, or claiming the throne directly right at this point. This, of course, leads to the final battle and the final showdown on the 29th of March 1461 at Towton in the Midlands. This is claimed to be the biggest battle ever fought on English soil. We don't really know the numbers, but speculation of around 60,000 against an army of around 50,000. More likely, sort of 25 to 30,000 against 35,000. Either way, it is the biggest battle fought on English soil. It's likely that the Yorkists had a bigger army, but the Lancastrians had the better position on the top of the hill. However, it seems that the wind was against them, and it was actually snowing on that day as well. So when the Yorkist arrows were fired from their bowmen, they sailed with the wind and struck the Lancastrians. But when the Lancastrians tried shooting back, they were shooting against the wind and their arrows dropped short. That meant that the Yorkist archers could then move forward and pick up these arrows and fire, again and again and again. And this seems to have really helped and certainly lured the Lancastrians off their strong position. Also, it's worth saying perhaps that this battle went on basically all day. It's a very, very long battle. Everyone kind of involved seems to have known that this was a decisive meeting of the two armies. In the end, after a lot of fighting, it was won decisively by the Yorkists, and Edward is able to claim the throne as Edward IV. Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son Edward all flee to Scotland. So, why was Edward able to win the throne in 1641? Well, Margaret of Anjou had played quite a good hand, but it was probably weaker than it seemed. She was pretty reliant on Scottish support after fleeing north following the defeat at Northampton. She was, as we've noted in previous episodes, herself unpopular, both for being French and also for being the Queen, a woman. She wasn't really in a position to lead the faction herself, even though she seems to have been more than capable of doing that. And then thirdly, Edward, her son, was still very young. He's not yet 10, which means that he is unable to kind of rally the troops himself. So although they look like they've got quite a strong position, it's not quite as good as it seems. And as we noted last time, she also does make mistakes, in particular the ill discipline of her army after Wakefield, and not going on into London after winning the Second Battle of St Albans. Other reasons for Edward winning, we'd say that Henry VI is quite a big reason, that he is just not capable of performing as a king needs to. He doesn't draw people towards him, and he's not capable of fighting in these battles or leading the troops. On the other hand, as a massive contrast, you've got young Edward of York as a capable military leader. He looks like a king, he acts like a king, and now he's won 2 battles at Towton, before that at Mortimer's Cross, and God seems to be on his side thanks to the Parhelion phenomena at Mortimer's Cross. Perversely, the death of Richard of York at Wakefield had also made the Yorkist claim stronger. Richard of York had died as heir to the throne, and so Edward kind of was able to step in. But also, whereas Richard of York had seemed maybe a bit arrogant in claiming the throne, Edward is claiming it due to his father being killed. And so it's a bit easier to swallow, perhaps, that claim. A bit easier to make that claim than Richard's, which seemed to come not out of nowhere, but a little bit left field. Finally, we should say that Warwick is super important in this story as well, that he is called the Kingmaker by history, and he certainly performs that role here. He rallies the troops in Calais. He's very popular in Calais, very popular in the southeast and in London, and helps win several important battles. So Edward wins partly because he's in a strong position and he's a good leader, partly because of the weaknesses of the Lancastrians, both their position not seeming as strong as it should be, Margaret's mistakes, Henry being not up to it, and then also we'd have to chuck in Warwick as an important factor too. Let's just weigh up the significance of Warwick as an individual in closing. He is a significant character in the story all the way through, really, from 1452. At 1452, he is still on Henry VI's side at Dartford when, you'll remember, York first makes his point that Somerset needs to be removed. And without the support of Warwick, York really has no ability to force that through and has to apologise. Crucially, 3 years later, it's Warwick at the First Battle of St Albans that really turns the tide in that battle and means that Richard of York captures the king and is able to bring about his second protectorate. It might also be Warwick that upsets the apple cart in 1459 when things were looking relatively stable with his attacks on French shipping in the Channel, though we're not really sure whether that's the crucial thing that happens. Although again, and sorry, I've already said about his captain of Calais through this period, he's very wealthy, lots of power, quite diplomatically astute, very popular, both on the continent and particularly in the south of England, probably the southeast of England. He then again wins at Northampton in 1460, and that's the second time that they catch a king. In fact, thinking about it, both times they catch the king at St Albans the first time, it's Northampton the second time. Both times Warwick is the key ingredient in the battle. So he always seems to be the person that tips the advantage towards the Yorkists right up until 1461, when probably Edward of York is more important there. Other reasons that you might say, well, it's not so much Warwick that's crucial, and that would be that Richard of York manages to lose at Wakefield despite Warwick's support. He's defeated at St Albans in the second battle. And I guess then overall, the point I've made here is that Warwick is never the man. He's always kind of the main supporting man. And so you might argue that without Richard of York, or later Edward of York, Warwick wouldn't have been able to exert the influence that he does. That said, without Warwick, it's unlikely that the Yorkists would have been able to carry the day in quite the same way that they did. So all this leaves us in 1461 with Edward on the throne and Henry VI in exile, the Yorkists in charge, and probably more because of their strengths than the Lancastrians' weaknesses, but definitely the weaknesses of Henry VI have played a crucial role in allowing this all to happen. I hope that happens. I hope that helps. And next time we'll be moving on to think about what happens at the end of Edward's reign and moving into Richard III. See you then.